The box arrived on a Tuesday. That specific ordinary kind of Tuesday where nothing is supposed to happen. You have leftover soup for lunch. You reply to 3 emails you've been avoiding. You think about calling your sister but don't. It was raining outside my apartment window in a thin, gray way, and I was still in the sweatshirt I'd slept in when the buzzer rang. The return address on the package said a law firm in a town called Aldervale, Kentucky. I had never heard of Aldervale, Kentucky. I had never, to my knowledge, spoken to anyone from there. The package was addressed to me, Celeste Harmon, in clean typed letters, no handwriting anywhere on the outside. Just my name and a label that said personal and confidential in small caps, the kind of label that makes you feel like you're about to find out something you can't unknow. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a while before I opened it. I'm 31 now. I was 28 when that box arrived. And I think about it the way you think about the moment right before a car accident. The last second where everything is still the way it was, and you don't know yet that the version of you standing in that moment is about to be replaced by a different one entirely. Inside the box was a letter from an attorney named Mr. Aldridge. It was short, professionally worded, and it told me that a man named Theodore Crane had passed away 6 weeks prior in Aldervale, Kentucky, at the age of 67. He had left behind no spouse, no children, and no surviving siblings. And in his will, witnessed and notarized, he had named me Celeste Harmon, daughter of Lynette Harmon, née Crane, as his sole beneficiary. The estate included a house on 4 acres, a truck, some savings, and a storage unit. I had to read it 3 times before I understood what it was saying, because I did not know anyone named Theodore Crane. I had never heard that name in my life, and my mother's maiden name, as I had always known it, was Pryor. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the second ring the way she always does, cheerful and a little distracted, already talking before she finishes saying hello. I read her the attorney's letter out loud. There was a pause on the line that I had never heard from her before. My mother is not a woman who goes quiet. She fills space. She has filled every space in every room I have ever shared with her for 31 years. The silence that came through the phone that evening was so foreign that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and checked that the call was still connected. Then she said, "Where did you get that? Not what does that mean? Not who is Theodore Crane? Not there must be some mistake. Where did you get that?" I told her about the package. I told her about the return address. She went quiet again, and then she said that she needed some time to think, and that she would call me back, and she hung up. She did not call back. I waited 2 days. I called her twice. Both times it went to voicemail. I left one message and did not leave a second one, because I have known my mother long enough to understand that when she retreats, pushing only makes the walls go up higher. On the 3rd day, I called Mr. Aldridge. He was kind in the cautious way that lawyers are kind when they know more than they're supposed to say. He confirmed the basic facts of the letter. He told me the estate had been in a holding pattern, pending my contact, and then he said something that has lived in my chest every day since. Mr. Crane was very specific in his instructions. He asked that if you chose to come, you be given access to the house before anything was sorted or removed. He said you'd understand why when you got there. I told him I didn't understand anything at all. He said, "I believe that's rather the point." I drove to Aldervale on a Friday morning, 11 hours from my apartment in Cincinnati. I had taken 2 days off work, packed a bag without knowing what I was packing for, and driven south into a state I had been through exactly once before, in the middle of the night, on a road trip with a college boyfriend who is now a stranger. Eastern Kentucky in October is a different world from the city. The trees were turning. Not the polite, curated kind of autumn that parks in Cincinnati do, where you get a few red maples near the fountain and some orange on the walking path. This was the full thing. Entire hillsides going gold and rust and deep burgundy, layered against each other like something painted in stages. I drove with the windows cracked even though it was cold enough that I needed the heater on low, because I wanted to smell it. Aldervale itself was a small town, the kind that has a diner and a post office and a barber shop, and not much else that announces itself. Mr. Aldridge's office was above a hardware store. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of desk that had clearly been there since before he was born. He handed me a key on a plain metal ring and a hand-drawn map to the property, because apparently the address didn't come up correctly on GPS. He also handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it, handwritten this time. He said Theodore Crane had left it with specific instructions that it be given to me unopened, and only to me upon my arrival in person. I held it the whole drive out to the property. 40 minutes on roads that got progressively smaller and more winding, past farms and creek beds and a church with a hand-painted sign. The map was accurate. I turned down a gravel lane lined with old oak trees so tall their branches met in the middle overhead, and at the end of it there was a house. It was modest. White clapboard siding, a wide front porch with 2 chairs on it, flower beds that had gone to seed for the season but were clearly tended with care in warmer months. There was a wind chime near the door made of river stones, the kind someone makes by hand. A wood pile stacked neatly along one side of the house. I sat in the car for a few minutes. Then I got out and walked up onto the porch, and I noticed something that made me stop completely. Next to the front door at eye level, there was a small wooden board mounted to the siding, and on it, burned carefully into the wood in block letters, were the words, "For Celeste. Whenever you find your way here." My name, my full name. On the side of a house belonging to a man I had never met. I had to sit down on the porch steps before I could open the front door. I sat there in the cold for a while, looking out at the oak trees, and I finally opened the envelope. The handwriting inside was deliberate. The kind of handwriting a person develops when they write by hand often, when they think about what they're putting down. Not elegant, but careful. Celeste, I have written this letter more times than I can count, and thrown away every version. This one I'm keeping because I'm running out of time, and I've decided that a letter that says too much is better than one that says nothing at all. My name is Theodore Crane. Your mother was born Lynette Crane. I am your mother's older brother, which means I am your uncle. I have known you existed since the day you were born, though I was never permitted to know you. I am not going to explain your brother's choices or excuse my own silences. What I will tell you is that there is a room in this house I kept for you. There is a box on the table inside it. I would like you to see it before anyone else does. The key you were given opens everything. I'm sorry it took this long. I hope you find something in this house that is worth the drive. Theodore. The inside of the house smelled like wood smoke and coffee and old books. It was clean. Not the sterile clean of a place that's been emptied out, but the lived-in clean of someone who took care of their things. There were bookshelves along the main wall of the living room, filled without organization. Paperback thrillers next to reference books next to what looked like handmade journals with cloth covers. There was a rocking chair near the window with a worn patch on the left armrest. There was a coffee mug still on the end table, and I had to stop myself from being undone by that detail, by the fact that someone had put a coffee mug down and not known it would be the last time. I found the room at the end of the short hallway. It was clearly a guest room, though guest room doesn't quite cover what it was. The bed had a quilt on it, handmade, in shades of green and blue. On the small dresser there was a vase with dried wildflowers in it. The bookshelf in the corner had a mix of titles that felt deliberate. Books about women artists, a few novels I had read and loved, one I had been meaning to read for 2 years and hadn't gotten around to, and on the small table by the window there was a box. Wooden, about the size of a shoebox, with a simple latch. No lock. Inside were photographs, not a few, dozens. Maybe close to 80 or 90 photographs, organized loosely in chronological order, each one labeled on the back in that same careful handwriting. The first ones were old. My mother as a teenager, my age, my cheekbones, the same way of holding herself with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, that I've never been able to shake. My mother at what must have been a high school graduation, standing next to a young man with a wide grin, who I slowly understood as I kept looking, was Theodore. A younger version of the man who must have become the person with the worn armrest and the careful handwriting and the dried wildflowers. Then there were photographs of me. That's where my hands started shaking. Me at what looked like maybe 2 years old, at some outdoor event, a county fair, maybe, or a community picnic. Blurry, shot from a distance, the kind of photo you take when you're not supposed to be taking it. Me at what had to be a school event, maybe 5 or 6 years old, in a red dress I didn't remember, but that felt strangely familiar when I looked at it. Me at maybe 9 or 10, walking out of what I recognized as the public library 2 blocks from the house I grew up in. On the back of each one, a date, and sometimes a few words. She looks like Lynette at that age. She laughed at something just before I took this. I couldn't hear it from where I was standing. She carries herself like she has somewhere to be. 51 photographs of me, taken from a distance, in public places, over a span of more than 2 decades. Not obsessive, not frightening. Something that felt, when I held them in my hands, more like grief made visible, like someone trying to stay connected to something they weren't allowed to touch. At the bottom of the box, under the photographs, there was a second envelope. Thicker. Inside were letters, each one dated, each one addressed to me, each one written and kept rather than sent. The earliest was dated about 3 months after I was born. The most recent was from 8 months ago. I counted them. 29 years of letters, 62 of them. More than 2 per year on average for my entire life. I sat on the edge of that bed with its handmade quilt and I read every single one. It took the rest of that afternoon and well into the evening. At some point the room got dark and I turned on the small lamp on the table without really thinking about it. I read about his life in Aldervale, the house he'd inherited from their parents, the landscaping work he'd done for years before his back gave out, the garden he kept, the neighbors he knew. I read about his failed attempt to reach my mother when I was 4, and again when I was 12, and once more when I was in college. She had returned his letters and blocked his number each time. I read about the private investigator he'd hired when I turned 21, just to know that I was okay, just to have an address to write, to even knowing he'd never send the letters. He wrote about ordinary things. What he was reading. A particularly good tomato crop one July. His feelings about the way winter came early that year and whether that meant anything about the spring. He wrote to me the way you talk to someone you're comfortable with, not performing, not trying to impress, just talking. In one letter, from maybe 5 years ago, he wrote, "I don't know who you've become, Celeste, but I hope you became someone who surprised yourself. That was always the thing I hoped for most, for you and for me both. I became someone I didn't expect, living a life smaller than I planned and happier than I deserved, I think. I hope you got something like that too." I stayed in Aldervale for 4 days. The neighbors came by one at a time in the way that small towns do. A woman named June from 2 properties over who brought a casserole and cried a little when she told me Theodore had mentioned me for as long as she'd known him. An older man named Gil, who had done odd jobs with Theodore for 30 years and who shook my hand very formally and said he was glad someone came, that he'd worried no one would. A woman from the church down the road who said Theodore had sat in the same pew every Sunday for 40 years and prayed, among other things, that the people he missed most would find their way to peace. Each one of them knew my name. Not vaguely, specifically. They knew I was Lynette's daughter. They knew I lived in Cincinnati. One of them knew I worked in graphic design, which shocked me until I realized he must have told them, must have pieced it together from whatever information the private investigator had provided years ago. I had been known in Aldervale, Kentucky, without ever setting foot there for decades. On my 3rd day there, I drove into town and called my mother from a bench in front of the post office, because the cell signal at the house was unreliable, and because there was something that felt right about making that call from a public place, somewhere solid, somewhere I couldn't face around in. She answered. There was a different quality to her silence this time. Not the calculating quiet of 3 weeks earlier, when she'd been deciding how much to say. This was something older, something that had been sitting untouched for a very long time. I told her where I was. I heard her exhale. I didn't ask her to explain. I had spent 3 days reading her brother's account of things, and I wasn't sure I needed her version to understand the shape of it. My mother had grown up in a family that fractured early. Their parents' marriage had ended badly. Their father had left the state. Their mother had been the kind of woman who coped by pretending that things that hurt had never happened at all. Theodore had stayed in Aldervale in the house they'd grown up in. My mother had left at 18 and never come back, and somewhere in that leaving she had cut every thread that connected her to that place, including him. He wasn't the villain of the story. Neither, I think, was she. It was the kind of the family damage that spreads quietly over decades because no one says the true thing at the right time, and then eventually the window for saying it closes, and you just keep going. But she had taken me with her when she left, and he had stayed. And for 29 years he had kept a room for me in a house I didn't know existed. My mother said, "I didn't think you'd ever find out." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how to explain it in a way that would make sense to you." I said, "You don't have to, not right now." That was the truest thing I knew how to offer her in that moment. I wasn't ready to be angry. I wasn't ready to forgive. I was somewhere in the middle of both of those things, in the place where a person lives when they've just found out that their life had a whole other country in it that they were never shown. She cried a little. I let her. Before I hung up, I told her that he had kept 62 letters addressed to me. That he had photographs, taken from a distance, from public places, just to be able to see who I was becoming. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "He was always like that. Even when we were little. He was the one who remembered everything." I drove back to the house on the gravel lane under the oak trees, and I sat on the front porch in one of the chairs until it got dark enough to see stars, which you can actually do in Aldervale, Kentucky, because there's not enough artificial light to crowd them out. I did not sell the house. A lot of people, when I tell this story, expect that to be the ending, that I sold it and used the money for something, that I closed the chapter. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't walk away from the room with the quilt and the dried wildflowers and the bookshelf someone had put together with care and reduce it to a line item. Instead, I did something that still surprises me when I think about it, because I am not generally an impulsive person. I went to see Mr. Aldridge on my last day there, and I told him I wanted to keep it, that I would need some time to figure out the logistics, that I was possibly going to use it as a place to work remotely a few months a year. He nodded like this was the answer he had been hoping for, though he was too professionally composed to say so. I also asked him if he knew anything about whether Theodore had wanted to be buried in Aldervale or somewhere else. He said the arrangements were already made, had been for years, and that Theodore had purchased a plot in the small cemetery at the edge of town. He said Theodore had, in his final instructions, left a note indicating that he hoped someone who loved him would visit eventually. Not urgently. Not soon. Just eventually. I went that afternoon. The grave was already there. The marker was simple, with his name and his dates, and below them a single line he had apparently chosen himself. He paid attention. I stood there for a long time without knowing exactly what I felt. Grief is a strange thing when it's for someone you never got to meet. It doesn't feel like loss the same way. It feels more like arriving late to something that mattered, and finding the room still warm, the lights still on, and no one there anymore. I talked to him a little. Out loud, quietly, in the way you do when you're alone somewhere, and it feels safer than silence. I told him about my life in Cincinnati, the things he'd missed, the work I do that I actually love. I told him about my apartment and the view of the river from my fire escape, and the fact that I drink my coffee the same way his mug suggested he had. No cream, just a little too hot. I told him I was glad the letter got to me. I have a relationship with Aldervale now. I go for about 6 weeks every fall, and sometimes a long weekend in spring when the wildflowers in the yard come back. The neighbors have become something like community. Gil comes by to help with the woodpile, and June brings food more often than I can consume, and I've started attending the church down the road occasionally, not because I am a particularly faithful person, but because I like sitting in the pew where Theodore sat for 40 years, and I like the idea of praying for the things he prayed for. I still have a complicated relationship with my mother. It's not broken. It's just honest now in a way it wasn't before, which means it's sometimes harder and also, underneath that, more real. She has asked to see the letters. I haven't decided yet whether I'll share them with her. Part of me thinks they belong to the two of us, to Theodore and to me, in a way that has nothing to do with the years of silence between him and her. Part of me thinks she might need to read them. I haven't landed anywhere permanent on that yet, and I've made peace with not landing anywhere. What I know is this. A box arrived on a Tuesday. It contained a key, a letter, and the outline of a family I hadn't known I had. It led me down a gravel road under oak trees to a house where someone had kept a room for me, and a box of photographs taken from a careful distance, and 62 letters written across 3 decades to a person he was not allowed to know. He paid attention. For 29 years, across a silence he hadn't chosen, and a distance he couldn't close, he paid attention. I used to think the people who raised you were the ones who defined what family meant. I think differently now. I think family is something that can exist in one direction for a very long time, quietly and without acknowledgement, maintained by someone who simply refused to stop. And I think that when it finally finds you, whether it takes a day or a decade or an entire childhood plus a few years past that, what it feels like is not completion exactly. It feels like someone left a light on, and you finally walked in out of the dark.